Hello, I'm Mitch Fox, president of the Nevada Broadcasters Association, and I'd like to welcome you to another edition of Nevada on the Air, a program that highlights the leaders and innovators and out-of-the-box thinkers who are making a big difference in communities throughout Nevada. A studio fire and a pandemic put us on a forced hiatus, but I'm excited to bring back this podcast and have Congresswoman Dina Titus on the program today. Currently in her sixth term in the U.S. House of Representatives, Dina is the Dean of Nevada's Congressional delegation. She's a proud member of the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, Foreign Affairs, and Homeland Security. I want to remind you that she was also a tenured professor of political science at UNLV, and everybody who's anybody was a student of hers. That's something that you'll notice when you go to these meetings. She also served several terms in the Nevada State Senate, starting in 1998. She's admired and respected throughout the state of Nevada as she works harder than anyone else, and I'm totally pleased to have her back on the podcast. Welcome.
Well, thank you. It's nice to see you, Mitch.
It's good to have you. Let's start in with the Pew Research poll. Did this poll at the beginning of the year and asked people what their biggest concerns were, the biggest issues were. And COVID had dropped. It used to be number one, but it's still the economy, inflation, the gas pump, used car prices, real estate prices. Tell us, in your view, how do we get to this place and where do you see the way out?
Well, Las Vegas was one of the hardest hit during COVID because we were so dependent on tourism and hospitality. We had 35% unemployment, which is the figure that goes back to the Great Depression. We haven't seen that in a long time. So we've had a long way to go to recover. But interestingly enough, we're the fastest recovering. So we were the hardest hit, but the fastest recovering. And now our unemployment's dropped from 35 to about 5. Airplanes are full, rooms are full, gaming revenue's up. We need to get more conventions coming and foreign tourists, but you can see we're on a recovery. People are doing better, but they don't really believe it. They're worried about sustainable prosperity. And when you go and fill up your gas tank, you feel it a lot. Now, the House is doing a number of things to try to deal with that, whether it's going after the big oil companies where they're just making record profits and the CEOs are making record salaries, looking at the supply chain, trying to build more in this country rather than having to be dependent on China to import things like chips that are in your phone, in your car, in slot machines. We should be making those here. Panels for solar power, should be making them here. So there are a number of efforts to bring those prices down. The economists predict that we have reached the peak. It's going to level out and will start to be reduced. And so that's what we're hoping for and what we're working towards.
Someone told me with these oil corporations, they've been, I hate to say this, but popping corks.
Right.
Throughout this. They got these leases out there that haven't been used.
Right.
And that's kind of the untold story, isn't it?
Well, it is. I think it's something like 900 leases that they haven't exercised or instigated, that it's much easier for them just to raise the price at the pump on you than it is to go out and excavate and dig and drill for new oil. So it's not that the government's keeping us from getting it. They are not doing it. The president has released some of the reserves. That should help to bring down the prices. He's also opened up some new leases on public lands. There's some here in Nevada for exploration if people want to do it. But it's just so easy to say, oh, that's Joe Biden's fault, instead of really looking at the facts.
Congress has done a lot. Everyone talks about the polarization and the name calling, but there has been quite a bit of legislation that's been passed. But when you talk to people about the Competes Act and Build Back Better and the Innovation Act and infrastructure, they kind of get a glazed look like, what does it mean for me? So tell us, maybe we're starting with the infrastructure. This is a big deal, almost like FDR size piece of legislation that passed and signed into law. What does it mean for Nevada?
Well, it is transformational, and it was bipartisan. And it's investments in all kind of physical infrastructure. It's funding for fixing roads and bridges. It's funding for expanding mass transit, like the CAT buses here in town. Funding to expand access to the internet. In rural Nevada, you can't get the internet in a lot of places, and you need that for business, just for personal communication, for medical things that are done on the internet. So that's a real plus. There's some money in there for climate change efforts, like going to electric cars, providing electric charging stations throughout the state. You know, the original CARES Act, which was to help us get through the pandemic on the health side, like with masks and vaccinations and assistance to hospitals, was based on population only. Well, since Nevada had the highest unemployment and we have a low population, I worked very hard as chair of the Economic Development Subcommittee to get that formula changed so it would include unemployment. And as a result, Nevada got an extra $1 billion that we would not have gotten. We got more money than Utah, for example. And some of that money came not in the infrastructure bill, but in some of those recovery packages. $800 million came to the Clark County School District to help them recover from COVID. So let's hope they use that money in some sustainable way that helps us raise our level of education.
You mentioned climate change, and it's almost like you have to be oblivious to what's going on. We're not looking forward to maybe even another summer of fires like, remember Tahoe and so many years in California. It was dreadful. It was really bad. Do you see it as that almost, one of those, I hate to use existential issue of our time that's overused, but does Congress really take it seriously, do you think?
Well, there are still some people who deny climate change. I mean, I can't believe it. Or they vote against it because they have interest in fossil fuels. But you're right. If we don't do something now, we don't have very long to catch this before it's too late. I'm glad you mentioned fires. You know, Nevada is the sunniest state, the warmest state, and the fastest warming state. And we had fires here as well as in California. And there's money in this infrastructure bill to help with fighting fires, but also mitigation to help bring the water level back up. Look at Lake Mead, how low that is. There's a big fund for recycling water that will allow us to partner with California to help with that drought situation. And, we're in a 1,200-year drought. We need to recognize it.
Well, you recently spoke to the Vegas Chamber, and the folks there were fascinated by your discussion of Ukraine because of your committee assignments and, of course, your interest in foreign affairs. You're really considered an expert on this particular issue, and a lot of people are torn. They see the horrors that are taking place there, but they're a little reluctant to go, maybe full nuclear or whatever. Tell us a little bit about where you see this particular area of the world right now and where it's headed.
Well, I am on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we've had a number of briefings, even one by the president of Ukraine, who, by the way, has become a real democratic hero. He'll go down in the history books, Zelensky will. We are sending humanitarian aid. We are sending military aid. We have sanctioned Russia to the limits. Russia sanctioned us back. In fact, I'm on their sanctions list. So I can't travel to Russia, not that I would want to. But the main thing is we have strengthened NATO. NATO is stronger now than ever, and I think Russia's intent was to weaken NATO. And I give Biden a lot of credit for that. You even see that Finland and some other countries are talking about joining. You see Switzerland, which has always been neutral, now giving assistance to Ukraine. So Europe is very united, and they have sent troops, and we have sent troops to the countries that border Ukraine. Now, we have said that's a red line. We're not going to send troops into Ukraine, nor airplanes, but we're sending just about everything else. The fear is, what will Putin do next? He's become very isolated. He's very much of an egomaniac. He doesn't like losing, and he has been losing in Ukraine. It's not worked out nearly to the extent that he thought it would be, a quick victory in and out and put in a puppet government. So what will he do? Is there a chance he'll use chemical weapons like he did with others in Syria? Is there a chance he would use a strategic nuclear weapon? And then what would the U.S. do? Will he then try to push the border into Romania and Moldova? Those are countries that are worried about being brought back under the influence of Russia like during the Soviet Union time. So those are still big ifs. He's been retreating to the east of Ukraine in territory that he's been fighting over for the last 8 years and pulled out of some areas. while declaring victory, but it has not been a victory. But it is brutal, it is gruesome, it's civilians who are being killed, and I think he's guilty of war crimes.
Yes, and the president made that case probably before anyone did, actually.
That's right.
I see what's going on. A lot of people are disturbed that there's different state legislatures that are actually making it more difficult for people to vote. Not easier to vote, but more difficult to vote. We're talking about Texas and Georgia and Arizona. And Congress is trying to get this Federal Voting Rights Act together. It seems to be common sense, at least to me, that you'd want to encourage Democrats and Republicans to vote. What's with that?
Well, that's kind of the hallmark of a democratic government or a republic. We elect people who go and represent us. So the more people who participate, the more democratic we are. But you're right. They're putting in place all kinds of things to make it difficult to vote. Shortening the time of early voting, what kind of ID you have to have, not allowing mail-in ballots, only one polling place in the whole county regardless of the size of it. All of that is harder on people of color and people with disabilities than anybody else. So they're just slicing them out of the electorate. We've passed out of the House several bills several times, and they're stuck in the Senate. One is just the John Lewis Act, which was named for the civil rights hero John Lewis, to put back in place some of the original protections that the Supreme Court issued after the Voting Rights Act of '64. Then there's a broader bill that was House Bill 1, we made it number 1, that would look at the whole campaign process and take out some of that dark money. People give a lot of money, you don't know who they are or where they're from or what their agenda is. So those two have passed out of the House, just sitting in the Senate. You cannot get the Republicans and McConnell to pass any kind of voting protection because they know they won't win an election up and square. So the best thing they can do is keep people out of the electorate.
Well, speaking of elections up and square, I can remember my wife and I sitting in front of our TV sets on a January 6th and just aghast, almost in tears about what was taking place. It was, I never thought I'd ever see such a thing. Now we have a January 6th commission, and there's some information that's been dribbling out and being leaked to the news media. What do you think will come of this, if anything?
Well, they've been very circumspect, and they've not tried to make this real partisan, even though they've been accused of that. The Republicans boycotted it, but Pelosi got 2 Republicans on there, including Ms. Cheney from Wyoming, and they have about driven her out of the party because of it. But they've called in so many witnesses, collected so many documents and tapes that they are really getting the full picture. Now, they've subpoenaed some people. The question is, will they subpoena the former president or not? Will they be able to get some of his records or not, because he claims executive privilege? They want to come out with a report before the election, but not right at the election, because it shouldn't be part of that kind of partisan politics. It should be more like the 9/11 Commission that looked at this in a straightforward way with the primary objective not just of punishing those who attacked our democracy, but of keeping it from happening again.
Congresswoman Titus, I have one last question for you, and that is, you're the one that comes back to this district every weekend.
Right.
I don't know, Southwest Airlines must love you, or wherever you fly. I don't know if you fly on a Bolton.
Southwest, that's right.
Southwest, right? And you keep at it. You're just as energetic as you've been, as I remember you in the state Senate. You still have that energy and drive. What do you see for the next year or two in terms of issues that you'd like to tackle for your district and really the entire state, if not the nation?
Well, we still have a long way to come back. We still want to work on the economy of Nevada, getting foreign tourists here, getting conventions back, getting people in good paying jobs. And infrastructure will help some of that. Not only will it make it easier to come to Las Vegas, like I-11 from here to Phoenix, if we can get that built, but it'll make it easier to get around once you're here. So I'm pleased with that. I will stay on the same committees I'm on now because Las Vegas is an international city, so those committees are very much in line with our needs in the district. Homeland Security, deals with immigration issues, how important that is. And also, anytime there's some kind of catastrophe, whether it's Oklahoma City or 9/11, you find some trace of people having to come through Nevada that we have to keep a watch on. And then foreign affairs, of course, international city. But infrastructure, we don't make anything here except dreams come true, I like to say. So we got to import it all, flowers, shrimp, people. So we got to have good infrastructure to make that happen. So I'll continue to work on that, all the while trying to make it as sustainable as possible, because you are right, global warming or climate change is the issue of the future. And if we don't do something about that, none of the rest of this will matter.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. Let's do it again.
Absolutely. And I'd like to thank you for joining us as well. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.